"Ma'am, step aside or you're going down with him." The officer's voice cut through the diner like a blade, sharp enough to freeze every fork midair, every whisper collapsing into silence as red and blue lights flickered across rain-streaked windows, turning the small roadside diner into something tense, something electric. And in the center of it all stood Ava Brooks, apron still tied, hands steady but heart pounding like a drum she refused to let anyone hear, because she had seen this before. Not this exact moment. Not this man pressed against the cold tile floor with suspicion hanging over him like a verdict already written, but the feeling, the quiet injustice dressed up as authority, the way people looked away when it mattered most, and Ava didn't look away. She stepped forward instead, just one step, but enough to shift the air in the room as the officer tightened his stance, waiting for compliance, expecting silence. Because that's what people like her were supposed to give. Silence and distance and obedience. But Ava's voice came out calm, clearer than she expected. "He didn't do anything. I was right here. I saw everything." And for a second the room held its breath. Even the rain seemed to hesitate against the glass, as if the world itself was listening. The man on the floor turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers not with panic, but something quieter, something heavier, like he understood exactly what it cost her to say that out loud. And still the officer didn't move, his jaw tight, his authority unquestioned by everyone except the one person who refused to step back. "You're interfering," he warned, but Ava didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch. She simply stood there, shoulders squared, as if dignity itself had taken form in the middle of a cheap diner off Highway 61. "No," she said softly. "I'm telling the truth." And that word hung there, truth, heavier than the flashing lights, heavier than the badge, heavier than the silence of every customer who chose not to speak. And something shifted, subtle but undeniable, a hesitation, a crack in certainty. The officer's grip loosened just enough for the moment to breathe, and minutes later, the tension dissolved like steam off a hot plate. The man was released, no apology offered, no explanation given, just a quiet ending to something that could have gone very differently. And as he stood, adjusting his jacket like none of this had touched him, he looked at Ava, really looked at her, and said only 2 words, "Thank you," before stepping out into the rain, disappearing into the night like a stranger who didn't belong to her story. Except stories like this never end when the door closes. They wait, they build, they return, and the next morning when Ava arrived for her shift, the diner wasn't the same. Black SUVs lined the parking lot, men in tailored suits moved with purpose, shutting down booths, speaking in low, controlled voices. And as Ava stood there, confusion rising like a storm she couldn't yet name, the door opened again, and the man from last night stepped inside, dry, composed, no trace of chaos, only quiet power in the way everyone around him seemed to adjust, to listen, to follow. And when his eyes found hers again, there was no urgency this time, only certainty, as if the truth she spoke had set something much bigger in motion. The room did not erupt. It tightened, like every sound had been pulled inward and locked behind invisible walls. And Ava could feel it in the way the air shifted around her, heavier now, thicker, as the men in suits moved with quiet precision, not loud, not aggressive, just controlled in a way that made people step back without being told. And the regular customers who usually filled the booths with chatter and coffee orders now stood near the edges, whispering, watching, trying to understand why a place that smelled like bacon and burnt toast suddenly felt like a boardroom. And Ava stood in the middle of it all, still in her uniform, still holding her order pad like it could anchor her to something normal. But nothing about this morning was normal, not the black SUVs outside, not the manager pacing nervously near the counter, not the way her name had just been spoken by someone who looked like he had never stepped foot in a place like this before. And then there was him, Daniel Carter, standing near the entrance like he had always belonged there, his presence calm but undeniable, the kind of calm that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. And Ava felt a strange tension in her chest, not fear, not exactly, but something close to realization, like a puzzle piece turning in her mind, trying to fit into a picture she had not seen yet. And when he started walking toward her, every step seemed deliberate, measured, as if the distance between them mattered, as if the moment itself needed space to unfold. and when he stopped just a few feet away, the noise in the diner faded again. Conversations dissolving into silence as if the entire room understood that whatever happened next would not be small. You showed up. Today, he said, his voice steady, not loud, but clear enough to carry, and Ava blinked, confused by the simplicity of it. I work here, she replied, her tone cautious, searching for something normal in a situation that refused to be normal, and for a brief second, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his expression, not amusement, not mockery, just recognition, like he had expected that answer. Yes, he said, nodding slightly. I know. And behind him, one of the suited men stepped forward, holding a tablet, speaking quietly about property transfers, operational control, legal documentation, words that sounded distant and unreal, like they belonged in another world. Not here, not in this small diner off a 2-lane road where Ava had spent the last 3 years balancing plates and ignoring comments that tried to make her feel invisible. And yet those words were real, and they were happening now. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to settle into place. Not all at once, but enough to change the way Ava looked at him. Because this was not just a man she had helped. This was a man who could change everything around her without raising his voice, without explaining himself, without asking permission, and that realization did not make her step back. It made her stand taller, just slightly, enough to remind herself who she was before this moment tried to redefine her. And Daniel seemed to notice that too, the way her shoulders squared, the way her eyes held steady, and something shifted in his gaze, something quieter, something more human, as if for the first time since he walked in, he was not looking at the diner, or the staff, or the situation, but at her, and only her. Do you know what you did last night? He asked, and Ava did not hesitate. This time, because she had already answered that question in her own mind. I told the truth, she said, and the words landed between them, simple, undeniable, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold on to that truth, as if it weighed more than everything else combined. Daniel did not look away when she said it, not immediately, and that pause was not hesitation, it was recognition, the kind that settles slowly but stays, and around them the quiet movement of suits and soft voices continued, papers signed, calls made, decisions unfolding in real time. But none of that seemed to matter in the small space between them, where something far less visible was shifting. Something not written on contracts or measured in dollars. The truth, Daniel repeated, almost to himself, as if the word had weight he had not felt in a long time. And Ava watched him carefully now, not as a stranger anymore, but not as someone she trusted either. Just a man whose presence had turned her ordinary morning into something unpredictable. And she could feel the eyes of everyone in the diner moving between them, waiting for something, maybe an explanation, maybe an outcome, maybe just a reason to understand why their world had changed overnight. And Daniel finally turned, slightly, gesturing toward the room, the booths, the counter, the kitchen where the smell of coffee still lingered like a reminder of what this place used to be just hours ago. This diner, he said, his voice calm, is part of a larger property acquisition that finalized early this morning. And the words landed like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. And Ava felt that shift again, deeper this time, because this was no longer about a single moment. From last night, this was something that had been in motion long before she ever stepped between him and those officers, something bigger than chance, bigger than coincidence, and yet somehow connected to her now in a way she could not ignore. So you own it, she said, not as a question, but as a statement she was still learning how to accept, and Daniel nodded once. Not with pride, not with arrogance, just fact. And for a moment the simplicity of that response made everything else feel even more complex, because power like that did not need to explain itself. It just existed, shaping outcomes quietly, efficiently, without asking who might be affected along the way, and Ava felt that realization settle into her chest, not as fear, but as clarity, the kind that forces you to see the difference between what is visible and what is real, and Daniel seemed to sense that too, the way her expression shifted from confusion to understanding, from reaction to awareness. Last night, he continued, his tone steady, you made a decision that most people would not make. and Ava let out a small breath, not because she disagreed, but because she knew exactly what he meant. She had seen the hesitation in the room, the way people chose comfort over truth, silence over risk, and she had chosen differently, not because she was fearless, but because she was tired of watching the same story play out again and again. "I did what was right," she said. And this time her voice carried something stronger, something rooted, and Daniel nodded again, slower now, as if that answer mattered more than anything else she could have said. And behind him one of the men approached quietly, handing him a document, whispering something about timelines and restructuring. But Daniel did not take it immediately, his attention still on Ava, as if this conversation held more value than the paperwork waiting in his hand. "People like to think power changes everything," he said, his voice lower now, more personal, but sometimes it just reveals who was already willing to stand when no one else would. And Ava felt those words land differently, not as praise, not as reward, but as a mirror reflecting something she had always carried but rarely saw acknowledged. And for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller, not because their worlds were the same, but because something in that moment was shared, something that did not belong to money or status or ownership, but to choice, to courage, to the quiet decision to speak when silence would have been easier. And as the diner slowly filled with movement again, orders forgotten, routines interrupted, Ava realized that whatever came next would not just be about what he owned, but about what she had proven, and that was something no contract could define. The words did not fade after he said them. They lingered, settling into the space between them like something that could not be taken back, and Ava felt it in the way her grip on the order pad loosened slightly, not because she was unsure, but because she was realizing that this moment was no longer just about what had already happened. It was about what was about to change, and change did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walked in quietly, dressed in tailored suits and calm voices, reshaping everything without asking permission. And as Daniel finally took the document from his associate, glancing at it for only a second before signing with a quick, practiced motion, the room seemed to exhale, as if a decision had just been finalized that no one else had been invited to understand. And Ava watched closely, not impressed, not intimidated, just aware, because power like his did not need to perform, it simply moved, and everything else adjusted around it. "What happens to this place now?" she asked, her voice steady but direct, and it was the first question that cut through the surface, not about him, not about last night, but about the reality standing right in front of her, the job she depended on, the routine she had built, the small world she had carved out one shift at a time. And Daniel looked up from the paper, meeting her gaze again, this time with something more deliberate, something that suggested he had already considered that question before she asked it. "That depends," he said. And the answer was simple, but the weight behind it was not. Because in that moment, Ava understood that the future of this diner, and maybe her place in it, was no longer decided by schedules pinned to a corkboard in the back office. It was decided here, in conversations like this, in choices made by people who never had to think about hourly wages or split shifts. And yet he did not look away. He did not dismiss her. He did not turn to his team for the answer. He stayed with her, as if her question deserved more than a corporate response. "Depends on what?" she asked, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful tone, just clarity, because she had already stepped into something bigger the night before, and she was not going to step back now. And Daniel held that gaze for a moment longer before answering, "On whether the people here are just employees or something more." And the words landed differently than she expected, not threatening, not transactional, but open, like an invitation she had not asked for. And Ava felt that tension again, the pull between two worlds that rarely touched, the one she lived in, measured in hours and tips and quiet endurance, and the one standing in front of her, measured in decisions that could change entire buildings before noon. And neither of them spoke for a moment, the silence not empty, but full, as if both were weighing what came next. And around them, the diner continued to shift, staff gathering in small groups, the manager whispering urgently with someone near the counter, uncertainty spreading in low voices. And Ava knew that whatever happened next would not just affect her, it would ripple through everyone here. People who had shown up expecting another ordinary shift, and were now standing inside something none of them could control. And that realization grounded her, not in fear, but in purpose, because if this moment was going to decide anything, she was not going to let it pass without being seen. Then you should know, she said, her voice firm now, carrying just enough to cut through the noise around them. People here work hard. They show up. They keep this place running when no one else notices. And Daniel listened, not interrupting, not correcting, just taking it in, and there was something in his expression that shifted again, something quieter, something closer to respect, as if for the first time, the diner was not just a line on a contract, but a place with weight, with meaning, because of the people inside it. And as Ava finished, she did not look away. She held that space, that truth, the same way she had the night before, and this time, the silence that followed did not feel uncertain. It felt like the edge of a decision waiting to be made. Daniel did not answer right away, and that silence was not empty. It was deliberate, like he was measuring not just her words but the conviction behind them, and Ava held her ground, not because she expected to win anything, but because she refused to disappear in a moment that clearly mattered, and around them the tension in the diner sharpened, employees watching from behind the counter, the manager standing frozen with a clipboard still in hand, unsure whether to step forward or stay invisible, and Daniel finally exhaled slowly, a quiet shift that seemed to ripple through the space. Most places, he said, his voice calm, run on numbers, margins, projections, and he glanced briefly toward the paperwork still in his hand before looking back at her. But numbers do not tell you who shows up when it matters. And that line landed heavier than anything he had said before, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true in a way that did not need to be proven. And Ava felt something tighten in her chest again, not fear this time, but recognition, because she had lived that truth, long hours, double shifts, days when no one noticed unless something went wrong. And yet she showed up anyway, like everyone else here, and Daniel took a small step to the side, turning slightly toward the room, as if seeing it differently now, not as a property, but as a place shaped by people. Last night, he continued, everyone in that room had a reason to stay quiet. And Ava knew exactly what he meant, the fear of getting involved, the instinct to avoid trouble, the comfort of letting someone else handle it. And you did not, he added, his voice softer now, more direct, and Ava did not respond immediately, because she did not need to explain herself again. She had already made that choice once, and it had already changed everything, and Daniel seemed to understand that, because he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them, before turning back to his associate, taking the tablet this time, reviewing something quickly, then handing it back with a quiet instruction that no one else could hear, and within seconds, the energy in the diner shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a new direction had just been set. And Ava noticed the manager being called over, his posture straightening instantly, his tone shifting from nervous to attentive as he listened, nodding quickly, glancing around the room as if trying to catch up with decisions that were already being made without him. And Ava watched all of it unfold, not confused anymore, but aware, because this was how power worked, not loud, not chaotic, just decisive. And when Daniel turned back to her, there was something different in his expression, something resolved. No one here is losing their job today, he said, and the words moved through the diner like a quiet wave, not loud enough to celebrate, but strong enough to change the air, and Ava felt the reaction around her before she even processed it herself, the tension easing, shoulders lowering, whispers shifting into something softer, something closer to relief, and she let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. But Daniel was not finished. In fact, he added, pausing just long enough to make sure the moment held. This place is staying exactly as it is. And that second statement landed even deeper, because it was not just about stability, it was about recognition, about preserving something that already worked, something that mattered. And Ava looked at him carefully now, not with suspicion, not with gratitude, but with understanding, because this was not just a decision, it was a response, not to the diner, not to the numbers, but to what had happened the night before. And Daniel met her gaze one more time, his voice steady. But one thing will change, he said, and the room seemed to lean in again, waiting, and Ava felt that edge return, not fear, not uncertainty, but anticipation, because she knew whatever came next would not be small, and Daniel held that pause just long enough for it to matter before speaking again. "I do not reward silence," he said. "I invest in people who choose not to stay invisible." And this time, there was no ambiguity in his words, no distance, no corporate tone, just a clear line drawn between what was and what could be, and Ava understood, not fully yet, but enough to know that this moment was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something she had not planned, but had already stepped into the moment she chose to speak. The words did not echo loudly, but they settled into the room with a weight no one could ignore, and Ava felt it immediately. The shift from uncertainty to something sharper, something more focused, as if the moment had just drawn a line between who she had been 5 minutes ago and who she was about to become. And around her, the staff exchanged glances, quiet but charged, because they understood what had just been said even if they did not fully understand what it meant yet. And Ava stood still, her thoughts moving faster now, not in panic, but in calculation, because this was no longer about surviving a shift or keeping her head down. This was about stepping into something that had just been placed in front of her without warning, and Daniel watched her carefully, not rushing her, not filling the silence, giving her the space to respond in her own time, and that alone said something. Because men like him were not known for waiting. And yet here he was, standing in the middle of a diner that still smelled like coffee and toast, waiting for a waitress to decide what came next, and Ava let out a slow breath, grounding herself, because she knew one thing clearly, whatever this was, it was not a gift, it was a choice, and choices always came with weight. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked, her voice steady, not hesitant, not eager, just direct, and a few heads in the diner turned slightly, listening more closely now, because the question mattered to all of them in ways they might not admit, and Daniel gave a small nod, as if he had expected that question too. "Opportunity," he said simply, but the word did not feel simple. It carried layers, implications, possibilities that stretched far beyond this room, and Ava tilted her head slightly, not dismissing it, but not accepting it either. "That can mean a lot of things," she replied, and there was no challenge in her tone, just truth, because she had learned a long time ago that words like that could be empty if you did not ask what was behind them. And Daniel's expression shifted again, not defensive, not impatient, but more focused, as if the conversation had just moved into a space he respected. "It means," he said, choosing his words carefully, "you do not have to stay where people expect you to stay." And that line hit differently, deeper than she expected, because it was not about money, not about position. It was about something she had felt her entire life, but rarely heard said out loud. And for a moment, Ava did not respond, because that idea, that possibility, required more than a quick answer. It required her to consider something she had not allowed herself to think about in a long time. And the diner around them seemed to fade slightly, not disappearing, but becoming background to a conversation that had just shifted from external to personal. And Daniel continued, his voice still calm, still measured. "You stood up when it was easier not to," he said. "And that tells me more than any resume ever could." And Ava felt that again, that quiet recognition, not exaggerated, not dramatic, just real. And she looked at him differently now, not as someone above her, not as someone she owed anything to, but as someone presenting a path she could choose to walk or walk away from. And that difference mattered, because it meant she still had control, and she held on to that, steadying herself in a moment that could easily have pulled her in too quickly. "And if I say no?" she asked, and the room seemed to pause again, because that question carried a different kind of weight, not about acceptance, but about independence, and Daniel did not hesitate this time. "Then nothing changes," he said, his voice even. "You keep your job, your routine, your life exactly as it is." And there was no threat in it, no pressure, just a clear line drawn between choice and consequence. And Ava studied his face for a moment, searching for something hidden, something unspoken, but she did not find manipulation. She found certainty, and that made the decision in front of her feel even more real, because it was hers to make, fully and completely. And as she stood there, the hum of the diner slowly returning around them, Ava realized that for the first time in a long time, the future was not something happening to her. It was something waiting for her answer. The question did not disappear after she asked it. It stayed there, steady and unshaken, like a line drawn in the middle of the room, and Ava felt every second of it as she stood facing him, not as someone waiting to be chosen, but as someone deciding whether she even wanted to step forward at all, and that difference changed everything. Because for the first time, the power in the moment did not feel one-sided. It felt balanced, not equal in status, not equal in resources, but equal in choice. And Daniel seemed to understand that too. Because he did not interrupt, he did not persuade, he simply watched, allowing the silence to do what silence does best when it is not forced. It reveals, and Ava's mind moved quickly now, not scattered, but focused, replaying the last 24 hours in fragments, the flashing lights, the weight of her voice when she spoke, the way everyone else had chosen to stay quiet. And then this morning, the suits, the decisions, the reality of who he was. And she realized something in that moment. Something simple but undeniable. None of this had happened by accident. Not the situation, not the outcome, not even this conversation. Because the moment she chose to speak, she had already stepped outside the life she thought she was going to keep repeating. And now the question was not whether things would change. It was how much she was willing to let them change. And Ava glanced briefly around the diner, really seeing it this time. Not just as a workplace, but as a space filled with people who had stories just like hers. People who worked hard, kept their heads down, and rarely got asked what they wanted beyond their next shift. And she felt that pull again. Responsibility, not just to herself, but to something bigger than this one opportunity standing in front of her. And when she looked back at Daniel, her expression had shifted, not uncertain, not overwhelmed, but clear. If I say yes, she said slowly, choosing each word with intention, it is not just about me. And the room seemed to lean in again, not physically, but in attention, because her voice carried something different now, something grounded, something that made people listen without realizing it. And Daniel did not speak. He simply nodded once, giving her space to continue. And Ava did, her voice steady, unwavering. I am not leaving this place behind like it does not matter, she said. And there was no emotion forced into the words, just truth. The same truth she had stood on the night before. These people matter. And for a moment, no one moved, not the manager, not the staff, not even the men in suits who were used to moving through spaces like this without noticing the people inside them. Because something in her words had shifted the focus again, away from contracts and ownership, back to something human, something real. And Daniel held her gaze, not surprised, not resistant, but thoughtful, as if he had expected strength, but not this kind of clarity, not this kind of boundary. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something in his posture changed, not in authority, but in acknowledgement, because what stood in front of him was not just someone who had done the right thing once. It was someone who understood the weight of what came next, and that mattered more than anything else he could have found on paper. Then do not leave it behind, he said, his voice steady, but softer now, more aligned with hers than before. Change it from within. And the words did not feel like an offer anymore. They felt like a direction, not imposed, but opened. And Ava felt that shift again, deeper this time. Because now the choice in front of her was no longer about stepping into his world or staying in hers. It was about bridging the two in a way she had never imagined possible. And for a brief second, everything else faded. The noise, the people, the movement, and all that remained was the realization that sometimes, the moment you choose not to stay silent is the same moment your life stops being small. The words did not rush her. They settled, slow and deliberate, like something meant to be understood rather than reacted to. And Ava stood there, letting them sink in, because this was not a moment that needed speed. It needed clarity. And for the first time since the morning began, everything around her felt quieter, not because the diner had stopped moving, but because her focus had narrowed to something sharper, something more defined. And she looked around again, but differently now, not as someone deciding whether to leave, but as someone considering what it would mean to stay with purpose. The worn booths, the chipped counter edges, the regulars who came in at the same hour every day, the staff who knew each other's schedules better than their own families. And she realized something she had never said out loud before. This place was not small. It had just been treated that way, and that difference mattered. Because something only feels small when no one chooses to see its value. And Ava turned back to Daniel, her expression steady, grounded in something deeper than opportunity. "If anything changes," she said, her voice calm but firm, "it has to make things better for the people who are already here." And there was no negotiation in her tone, no attempt to impress, just a line drawn clearly, the same way she had drawn it the night before, and Daniel listened, not interrupting, not redirecting, and when she finished, he gave a slight nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, as if that condition was not unexpected, but necessary. "Then that is where we start," he replied, and the simplicity of his answer carried weight, because it did not dismiss her concern, it aligned with it, and behind him, the quiet movement of his team shifted again, subtle but immediate, as instructions were adjusted, conversations redirected, and Ava noticed it this time, the cause and effect of words spoken with intention, and she felt something change inside her, not excitement, not relief, but direction, the kind that does not overwhelm you, but steadies you. And for a moment, the distance between what she knew and what she did not know felt smaller, not because she suddenly understood everything, but because she knew where she stood, and that was enough to move forward, and Daniel took a step back, not away from her, but into a position that felt less like control and more like space, as if the center of the moment had shifted slightly toward her without being announced, and Ava felt that too. The subtle transfer of focus, not an ownership, but an influence, in it, was unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable, because it was not given blindly, it was earned, and she held on to that, steady, aware, present, and around them. The diner began to breathe again, conversations returning in low tones, movement resuming, but nothing felt exactly the same, because something had been set in motion that could not be undone, and as Ava adjusted the edge of her apron, a small, ordinary gesture in the middle of an extraordinary moment, she realized that she was still standing in the same place, but she was no longer standing in the same position, and Daniel watched her for a brief second longer before speaking again, his voice quieter now, almost conversational. "This is not about changing who you are," he said. "It is about giving that strength a place to matter." And Ava met his gaze without hesitation, because she understood now, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize that this was not a story about being chosen. It was a story about choosing to step forward, and as the light from outside shifted through the windows, soft and steady, Ava made a decision that did not need to be announced, because it showed in the way she stood, in the way she looked at the space around her, in the way she did not step back. And in that quiet, unspoken moment, something changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, because sometimes the biggest shift does not happen when power arrives. It happens when someone decides they are no longer willing to stay invisible. The decision did not arrive with a dramatic moment. It settled into Ava the way truth always had, quietly, firmly, without needing permission. And as she stood there in the middle of the diner that had once defined the limits of her world, she realized something had already changed before she even spoke, not outside, not in the suits or the contracts or the man standing in front of her, but inside, in the way she now saw herself in this space, not as someone passing through shifts and schedules, but as someone who had a voice that could shape what happened next. And that realization did not make her louder, it made her steadier, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried that same grounded certainty. "Then we start here," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any long explanation could have, because it was not just agreement, it was commitment, not to him, not to the opportunity, but to the standard she had already set the night before. And Daniel watched her. For a moment, not surprised, not impressed, but understanding, as if this outcome had been possible from the moment she chose not to step aside. And he gave a slight nod, not as approval, but as alignment, as if two separate paths had just chosen to move in the same direction. And around them, the diner continued to return to life, coffee machines humming again, orders being called out, the rhythm slowly rebuilding itself. But something underneath it had shifted permanently, something unseen, but undeniable, and Ava felt it in the way people looked at her now, not with curiosity, not with distance, but with recognition, as if they had just witnessed something they could not fully explain but could not ignore either. And she did not react to it. She did not step into it. She simply accepted it, the same way she had accepted the moment the night before, with quiet presence, and Daniel turned slightly, speaking to his team again, this time with clear direction, but without urgency, because whatever needed to happen next would happen, and it no longer required tension to move forward. And as he began to walk toward the door, the same door he had walked through as a stranger less than 24 hours ago, he paused just briefly, turning back toward Ava one last time. "You did not just change last night," he said, his voice calm, almost reflective. "You changed what happens after it." And the words did not feel like praise, they felt like truth, and Ava held them for a second, not to keep, but to understand. Because she knew this was not the end of a story, it was the beginning of something that would require more than one moment of courage, more than one decision to speak. And as the door opened and the light from outside filled the space behind him, Daniel stepped out without waiting for anything else, because he did not need to stay to control what came next. And Ava stood where she was, in the same diner, in the same uniform, but no longer in the same role, and she picked up her order pad again, not as something to hide behind, but as something to carry forward, because this was still her place, still her people. But now it was also something more, something she had a hand in shaping. And as she moved back into the rhythm of the room, taking an order, offering a quiet smile, doing the same work she had always done, it felt different, not because the work had changed, but because she had. And in that difference was something no one could take from her, something that did not depend on ownership or titles or power, something earned in a moment when silence would have been easier. And as the day moved forward, ordinary on the surface but altered underneath, one thing remained clear: he had the power to own the room, but she had the courage to change it.